We are going to talk about another important aspect of feminist theory. This is the relationship of two very important approaches. One is post-colonialism and one is feminist theory. So, how post-colonialism relates to feminist theory, or if we put it differently, what kind of relationship is there between feminist theory and post-colonialism? You know that we have been talking about the relationship of theory to feminism, and we made this point at the beginning of our talk that feminism has sought strategic alliances with different theoretical positions. So you can have feminist theories who are using Marxism, feminist theories who are using structuralism, feminist theories who are using deconstruction, and that way we have tremendous variety within the ranks of feminist theorists. And since we are also talking about the literary dimension of feminism, we are discussing feminism in a literature class. So obviously, these two dimensions, relationship of feminism to theory, and how we bring examples from literature, or how we also sufficiently stress the literary dimension of feminism remains relevant. I also made this remark last week that I wrote these important blogs for ePathshala, and the text of these blogs is available online. But here I'm trying to take help from that text and also, in fact, explaining little bit wherever it is necessary. So we begin our discussion of post-colonialism and feminist theory. Since about the 1990s, and the date is important, since about the 1990s, post-colonial theory and criticism has had a major impact on literary and social studies. Words like post-colonial studies, post-colonial literature, or post-colonial cinema are frequently encountered. Students of literature, language, and social sciences and law, they now see their subject in a new light thanks to the post-colonial theory. The insights from post-colonial theory are so rich that they illuminate not only the abstract world of our ideas, but also the everyday world of our habits and practices. Thus, how we dress, the way we do, how we view things in terms of inferior superior dichotomy, why we consider some colors and some shapes more important than others. These are all partly explained by post colonial theory. We can also have some basic familiarity with some terms, some basic terms, which we encounter again and again when we study post colonial theory. So, what are those basic terms? The basic word in post colonial is colony. The word colony gives us many more words, namely colonize, colonial, colonizer, colonization, decolonize, and decolonization. These are all words which are derived from the word colony. Colonize, colonial, colonizer, colonization, decolonize, and decolonization. And each word stands for a particular concept. In the same way, the prefix post gives us words like post-colonial and post-colonial with or without hyphen. The hyphen and no hyphen in this case sometimes suggesting a different range of meaning, different range of meanings of words. The colony is to be seen in relation to the mother country. Thus, if India was the colony of Britain, then Britain was the mother country. If France was the mother country, Algeria was its colony. Colonizers were people in control of the colony, the British and French colonizers in most cases. Because if we talk about colonial history of the world, and probably Britain and France, they were the most, say, powerful imperial powers. Colonizers were people in control of the colony, the British and the French colonizers in most cases. The word colonial is used in conjunction with other words. And what are those words? Colonial masters, colonial people, colonial period, colonial. Decolonization, on the other hand, refers to a particular phase in history when a number of countries started winning their independence from powerful colonial powers like Britain and France. Many of these countries, mostly from Asia and Africa, achieved their independence after 1940. That means after the Second World War. However, the word colonization is also used to refer to the shedding of many colonial practices, beliefs, and habits, a process not easily accomplished. You see, colonial power may disappear, but colonial practices, colonial thoughts, or colonial thought patterns, or colonial habits, or colonial beliefs, they may not disappear. As such, decolonization of the mind is an ongoing process and is very complex in nature. The word colonialism can also be differentiated from words like imperialism, neo-colonialism, and internal colonialism. The last term to be seen in relation to nationalism. That means internal colonialism is to be discussed in relation to nationalism. Colonialism refers to occupation of lands with the significant physical presence of the colonizers. Physical presence of colonizers is important in the concept what is known as colonialism. Whereas imperialism is more a form of ideology in which the actual presence of colonizers in the colony may not be necessary, but the colony, especially its economy, may still be controlled by the imperial power. Whereas the phase of colonialism may well be over, one reason being the resistance encountered by the rulers and the other being the expensive nature of the colonial game. Imperialism continues to define relationships between independent nations. So you may have countries where the phase of colonialism is over. That means you don't have any foreign power occupying that land. But we do have the phase of colonialism where the economy of a particular country is controlled by an imperial power. The cry of globalization, with its important agencies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, help the cause of imperialism in subtle ways. Neo-colonialism is used as a synonym of imperialism, the word neo suggesting the hidden nature of colonialism, in which the oppressive presence of colonizers is not noticed by the colonial power, but their lives are nevertheless affected by the processes of imperialism. Internal colonialism, on the other hand, refers to nationalism acting like colonialism and applying force to control its own people. That means within a country, a certain people may be controlled. That is kind of internal colonialism. Internal colonialism, on the other hand, refers to nationalism acting like colonialism and applying force to control its own people. It is a known fact of our world that many religious, racial, and ethnic groups, often facing discrimination, seek some form of independence from the dominant power in their land. In turn, they are ruled by force, and the power relationship between the two unequal groups makes integration of the country a difficult proposition. The theory and the theorist. The theory and the theorist. That means in this, we also have theory and we also have theorist. That means when we talk about imperialism, colonialism, or such concepts, then obviously there are some important names which we need to discuss, right? I'll just take 1 minute, 1 minute, just a minute, right? So when we think about the theory and when we think about the theorist, history bears out that where there is power, there is resistance. The question of power and resistance provides two different directions to post-colonial theory. Among the figures who have focused their attention to resistance, the names of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, an Algerian writer and revolutionary, Frantz Fanon are very important. Frantz Fanon, you must have heard his name. Gandhi's concept of non-violence, and I think you are familiar with this concept. Gandhi's concept of non-violence, his use of religious, spiritual vocabulary, his idea of renunciation, and his radical critique of Western civilization provide an interesting narrative in post-colonial theory. Fanon, on the other hand, was a devotee of non-violence. A psychoanalyst by training and a revolutionary by conviction, he is a major presence in post-colonial theory. Fanon's two influential books, Black Skins, White Masks, it was published in 1952, and The Wretched of the Earth, it came out in 1961. These two books put the focus on the effects of colonialism on the colonized people. The effect of the gaze of the colonizers turns the colonized from subject to object. Fanon reports how the names given to him by the white man, the description bestowed on him, the negative epithets like Negro or nigger used by the white man made myself, and these are his words, made myself an object. What else could it be for me but an amputation, an excision, a hemorrhage that spattered my whole body with black blood? But I did not want this revision, this thematization. All I wanted was to be a man among other men. Unquote. What Fanon painfully learned was that his identity was being made by someone else. He was an individual, but somebody else was making his identity. It is the white man who was defining his identity. He ceased to be a man like other men and became an object instead. That means he became an object for others to view, for others to see, for others to define. Fanon sees Hegel's concept. Hegel is everywhere in theory, important philosopher. Fanon sees Hegel's concept of self and other and identity formation in terms of race and observed its disastrous consequences for the black native. The person with the black skin, as Fanon ruefully learns, and I quote his words, wants to be like the master, therefore he is less independent than the Hegelian slave. In Hegel, the slave turns away from the master and turns toward the object. Here the slave turns towards the master and abandons the object. In other words, the slave's existence depends totally on the master. He has internalized his master's personality to such an extent that he has lost his own. You see, this was Fanon. There is another very important name in post-colonial theory, Edward Scythe, and especially his book Orientalism, which came out in 1978. The publication of Edward Scythe's Orientalism is generally considered to be the key movement in the history of post-colonial studies. It is truly a study of the power of colonial discourses. This book received a lot of critical attention, both positive as well as negative. Said defined Orientalism, and I quote his words, as a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. Orient and the Occident. Unquote. In other words, the binary opposition between the East and the West present the East as the West's contrasting idea and its other. So East and West. Orient is East and Occident is West. So this binary opposition between the East and the West is relevant here, and they present each other as contrasting ideas. And East becomes the other of the West. The othering of the Orient has taken place through West representation of it, especially in the 19th and early 20th century. Said further defines Orientalism as, and I quote his words, as a Western style of dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. That is, Western style of dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Unquote. The Orient, as Said argues, has been a Western construction. That means it was made by West. And it is defined by its despotism, splendor, cruelty, and sensuality. The people in the East do not have individual characteristics, they rather fall into predictable types. The East has also been timeless and unchanging, and these are categories which Said identified that in Western construction of the East is timeless, it is unchanging. It has also been a Western fantasy. That means East becomes a Western fantasy. It has helped define the West as democratic, liberated, and enlightened. That means East has helped define West as enlightened, democratic, democratic, and liberated. Said acknowledges his debt to Michel Foucault's concept of discourse in his analysis of the Western representations of the East. But whereas Foucault's focus was on power transforming knowledge, Said's concern, and I turn to Leela Gandhi's book, her book Post-Colonial Theory, A Critical Introduction. Said's concern, as Leela Gandhi says, was in critiquing the conditions under which knowledge might be transformed and vitiated through the contagion of power. Said takes Orientalism as a paradigmatic instance of institutionalized and degraded knowledge to be opposed through an adversarial and oppositional counter knowledge. Said's book is written in a post-structural context, though it presents its complex ideas in a very lucid language. Said's book was a major influence on the study of marginality. Marginality, you understand, where a certain section is marginalized. A fact affirmed by no less a critic than Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Suddenly, marginality became a buzzword, a literary fashion in literary studies. Different marginal groups, and they included not only ethnic groups but also women in different parts of the world, could be studied using insights from Said's book. Said has often been criticized for not sufficiently highlighting the issue of resistance in his account. Marxist critic Ejaz Ahmed has especially been a very bitter critic of Said for not taking note of the reception of the Western representations by the colonized people. This is Ejaz Ahmed in his book In Theory. In the same way, even the West appears a monolithic category in Said's work, say some of his critics. Said's inadequate attention to the Western women's representation of the Orient is also noted by his critics. That means these are some limitations of Said's book. He does not pay sufficient attention to Western women's representations of the Orient. In his book Culture and Imperialism, and this is another important book by Edward Said, Said addressed the issue of resistance. He introduced the post-colonial concept of contrapuntal reading of text. A, a contrapuntal reading takes into account, and I am quoting his words from Culture and Imperialism, a contrapuntal reading takes into account both processes, that of imperialism and that of resistance to it, which can be done by extending our reading of the text to include what was once forcibly excluded. In La Stranger, for example, the whole previous history of France's colonialism and its destruction of the Algerian state, and the later emergence of an independent Algeria, which of course Camus opposed. Unquote. That means if one is looking at a work like Stranger or Outsider, which is what it appears in many translations, then the work is also implicated in the history of colonialism. Said's reading of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, in which he uncovers the noble's relationship to colonies and the empire, is a classic example of contrapuntal reading. he demonstrated a method of reading which was picked up by other critics. Fanon and Scythe are not the only influential figures in post-colonial theory. Indian critic Homi K. Bhabha and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak are the other important names in post-colonial theory. Mention must also be made of the highly talked about book The Empire Writes Back by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith, and Helen Triffin. So this is about the theories. There is also this relationship between post-colonialism, nationalism, and the women question. Any history of colonial domination will not be complete without mentioning the history of resistance against colonial rule. In most countries with a history of colonialism, there has also been a phase of a struggle against colonial rule. We are familiar with the Indian freedom struggle, which gradually developed momentum in the early 20th century. The main idea, which would gradually unite people in their battle for independence against the colonial rule, was the concept of nationalism. It should not come as a surprise that nation and nationalism are the concern of a great number of post-colonial poets, novelists, critics, and theorists. As noted by many commentators, the concept of nation is of a fairly recent origin and is related to the phase of industrialization and imperialism. The idea of the nation can also be inculcated in people. The role of many symbols, traditions, narratives, and heroes in forging a sense of national identity has been stressed by many commentators. At times, this process can be considered very selective by the critics of nationalism. Thus, we considered some traditions and some heroes from the past more important than others. These traditions and narratives are rehearsed on different occasions to develop a sense of national identity. In other words, the idea of nation is just not there. Efforts are made to develop this idea, to nurture this idea, and to strengthen this idea. The concept of nationalism has also been critiqued from a number of perspectives. Nationalism itself can become a form of domination and can perpetuate many aspects of colonialism. It can claim to speak for the whole nation, while in truth, it may speak only for the dominant groups in the nation. A nation, especially in our post colonial phase, can consist of diverse groups. People belonging to different ethnic, linguistic, sexual, and cultural identities can live in a country, but nationalism often speaks the language of the most dominant group. While discussing Orientalism, we noted the critics' interest in marginality studies. The dominant voices in the nation can marginalize many weaker groups. This has implications for women. Nations have often been represented in terms of motherhood. We are familiar with expressions like Mother Britannia or Mother India. The narrative of the freedom struggle has been presented in patriarchal terms, and the contribution of women to it or the process of decolonization has not been sufficiently acknowledged. More recently, work by many feminist historians has tried to highlight the narrative of women, feminist historians. That means history seen by feminist critics. John MacLeod, he is an important writer who has written this book, Post-Colonialism. He summarizes the feminist critique of nationalism offered by Floya Anthias and Neera Yuval Davis in their book Woman, Nation, State. So that means this is the thesis of Yuval Davis in this book, Woman, Nation, State. Women appear in five major ways in nationalist discourses. What are those five major ways? First, as biological reproducers of members of ethnic collectivities. Second, as reproducers of the boundaries of ethnic national groups. Third, as participating centrally in the ideological reproduction of the collectivity and as transmitters of its culture. Right. Fourth, as signifiers of ethnic national differences. Five, as participants in national, economic, political, and military struggles. In other words, These five categories celebrate women's role as mothers who produce children, especially sons, and their role in passing on the nation's culture to their children. Women are forbidden to marry or have sex outside their religious ethnic group. Any disrespect to women is considered a disrespect to the entire group because they mark the boundary between groups. Both feminism, and here we further talk about this, both feminism and post-colonialism are concerned with the question of marginality. The colonized native in post-colonial theory and the woman in feminist theory are both marginalized figures. As such, both theories, which have developed separately, share some formal patterns. If the woman in feminist theory is replaced by the colonized native in post-colonial theory, the discourse would still retain its form. Both feminism and post-colonialism are oppositional discourses. They have an enemy. They display a tone of anger and an acute sense of historical wrong, and they demand a new historiography. But whereas feminism made its appearance in the humanities and the social sciences after the second wave feminism, the relationship between feminism and post-colonialism, which became an academic subject in the 1990s, exposed many blind spots in the two perspectives. Feminism looked at through post-colonial lens appeared divided and vulnerable to criticism. Similarly, feminism points to many gaps in post-colonial theory. The history of the freedom struggle in India, seen through a feminist viewpoint, for example, would appear a little different. Right? Kirsten Halls Peterson and Anna Rutherford talk about a double colonization of women in colonialism and patriarchy. Double colonization refers to two orders of reality. Women are victims of colonial representations and they are equally oppressed by patriarchal norms. Colonialism celebrates male myths like the explorers, empire builders, and the missionaries. To just take the example of empire builders, great champions of the British Empire like Rudyard Kipling emphasized the importance of physical fitness for the empire builders. Rana Kabbani's book Imperial Fictions Myths of Orient, it was published in 1994. It argues how the Eastern woman, as she appears in the genre of travel writing, is an object of lust who arouses desire. Colonialism and patriarchy combine forces to turn her into an exotic figure. Not that she is any different in the writings of Western women travelers. Western women writers were equally guilty of perpetuating colonial patriarchal attitudes about the Orient. Leela Gandhi identifies three areas of controversy which fracture the potential unity between post-colonialism and feminism. What are they? The debate surrounding the figure of the third world woman, the feminists as imperialists, and finally the colonial deployment of feminist criteria to bolster the appeal of the civilizing nation. The debate surrounding the third world woman has gendered a lot of controversy. The category of third world woman has been attacked for its ethnocentric bias, for hiding racial prejudices, and for stabilizing an whole hierarchy in neo-Orientalist terms. As first world refers to the Western world, Europe and United States of America, to be precise, third world refers to countries in Asia and Africa. Scythe Orientalism has established that the first world in most Western accounts is enlightened, liberated, democratic, and rational. And the third world is just its opposite. And since post colonial studies generated a lot of academic interest in the concept of marginality, the figure of the third world woman appeared to epitomize the very concept of marginality for the Western feminists. She was doubly colonized. However, there are problems in the simple notion of double colonization, as critics like Trin T. Minha, Chandra Mohanty, and Gayatri Spivak have argued. The third world woman becomes an object which serves the intellectual and discursive interests of the Western feminism. She became a subject of study and a site for creating knowledge. She became a monolithic category. She became an interesting figure because she possessed an otherness which Western feminism demanded. She held the promise of a permanent supply of alterity, which is otherness, for an all too adventurous Western feminism. Right. So here we have so far discussed different aspects of post-colonialism and feminist theory and the relationship of feminism and post-colonialism. We will resume this discussion tomorrow or in our next class because this discussion is not complete yet, right?
Okay, sir.
I did not want to actually rush